The fluorescent light above Locker 7 had been flickering for 11 days. Elara knew because she was the one who logged the maintenance request. She also knew it would be ignored for another 3 weeks, because that was how long requests from the cleaning staff took to get actioned at Apex Aeronautics, if they got actioned at all. She clipped her tool belt around her waist, pulled the navy jumpsuit zip to her collar, and picked up her mop. 6:02 a.m. The executive floor opened to staff at 9, which meant she had just under 3 hours to scrub, buff, wipe, and disappear before the people who mattered started arriving. That was the deal. Be invisible, be quiet, be grateful. She had learned that lesson the hard way. The elevator doors opened on the 34th floor, and the silence hit her like always, that particular kind of corporate silence, thick and expensive, where every surface was glass and chrome, and you could hear your own heartbeat if you listened hard enough. She wheeled her cart past the framed covers of Aviation Weekly, past the signed photographs of Julian Thorne shaking hands with senators and tech moguls, and at least one sitting president. She didn't look at them anymore. She had a system. She started at the east end, worked west, hit the restrooms last, and was back in the elevator before the senior team's assistants arrived. 3 years of doing it the same way. 3 years of disappearing. But on this particular Tuesday morning, the boardroom door was open. That was the first thing wrong. The second thing wrong was the shouting. Elara slowed her cart outside the glass wall, not meaning to look but looking anyway, because the voice was loud enough to rattle the display case of model turbines mounted on the opposite wall. Julian Thorne stood at the head of the table, jacket off, sleeves rolled, and his face the color of a traffic light that had chosen red and stayed there. Around him sat 6 engineers in various states of suppressed panic, tablets open, laptops humming, heads bowed like men awaiting a verdict they already knew was bad. 6 months, Julian said, his voice dropping suddenly into something more dangerous than the shouting. 6 months and $62 million, and I'm standing in front of the Hargrove Group on Friday with nothing but a turbine that keeps tearing itself apart at 4,000 RPM. Tell me something useful. Tell me anything that isn't a variation of "we're still investigating," because so help me, I will. He stopped, not because he had run out of words, because the water cooler in the corner had just made a sound. Elara had been in the act of lifting the heavy replacement bottle, all 19 liters of it, and her grip had slipped, and 3 precise drops of water had fallen directly onto the open blueprint spread across the edge of the meeting table. The room went still. She looked up. Julian was looking at her, so was everyone else. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I'll get a cloth right now. Do you know what that paper costs?" His voice was very quiet. That was somehow worse than the shouting. "That blueprint," he said, walking toward her with the measured pace of a man who had learned that slow was more frightening than fast, "is a proprietary technical draft produced by engineers who spent 3 collective years in university learning how to put things on paper that people like you will never understand." He tilted his head. "That paper costs more than your annual salary, sweetheart. Do you understand that?" Elara said nothing. Julian reached into the pocket of his jacket, which was draped over the nearest chair, and pulled out his money clip. He peeled off a $20 bill, looked at it for a moment, then dropped it, not placed it, dropped it onto the floor at her feet. "For the trouble," he said, "stick to the Windex, leave the physics to the grown-ups." He turned back to his engineers, as if she had already ceased to exist. Elara looked at the 20 on the floor. Then she looked up at the blueprint. She wasn't trying to read it. She wasn't trying to be clever or prove a point or cause a scene. She just happened to look, the way your eyes drift to a word you recognize even in a crowd of text. And she saw it. She picked up the $20 bill, folded it twice without thinking, and tucked it into her breast pocket. She collected her cloth, wiped the 3 drops from the corner of the blueprint, which had, truthfully, not damaged a single calculation, and she walked out of the boardroom without a word. The elevator took 38 seconds to reach the ground floor. She counted everyone. If you're watching this and you've ever been talked to like you don't matter, stay with me, because what happens next is going to be worth every second. Subscribe if you haven't yet. This channel exists for stories exactly like this one. The error was in the stress load distribution on the 7th stage compressor blade. Elara knew this the way she knew the square footage of every floor on this building, quietly, without fanfare, because knowledge didn't require an audience. The Navier-Stokes formulation the Apex team had used assumed incompressible flow across the blade's surface, but at the velocity range they were testing, the compressibility effects were not negligible. They had ignored a turbulence variable in the boundary layer transition, which meant every simulation they ran was predicting a pressure tolerance the physical blade could never actually achieve. That was why it kept shattering. Not because the design was fundamentally flawed, because the math was wrong. She knew this at 6:47 in the morning. She spent the rest of her shift not thinking about it, because thinking about it was the kind of thing that led to bad decisions. She clocked out at 9:15, took the bus home, tutored a doctoral candidate in fluid mechanics from 2 to 5 in the afternoon, ate the leftover rice she had made on Sunday, and went to bed. She lasted until midnight. Because the turbine was going to keep shattering. The Hargrove Group meeting was Friday, and $62 million and 6 months of work was going to collapse because of a variable someone had decided was too small to matter. She got back to the building at 12:20 a.m. Her access card covered overnight cleaning on Tuesdays, always had. She took her card up to the R&D floor, which she wasn't technically supposed to enter without a supervisor present, but the supervisor had signed off on the floor being included in her route 2 years ago, and no one had ever updated the paperwork. Bureaucracy had its uses. The R&D lab was dark except for the standby glow of monitor banks and the red emergency exit signs that painted everything in a dim, surgical light. The master whiteboard stretched 8 feet across the east wall, covered in the accumulated failure of 6 months, variables in 3 colors. Crossed-out equations, margin notes in increasingly frustrated handwriting. Someone had circled the same cluster of calculations 3 times in green marker. Someone else had drawn an arrow pointing to it with a question mark and nothing else. She knew exactly what that question mark meant. It meant they were close. It meant they could feel the shape of the answer without being able to see it. That was the most particular kind of frustration in technical work, not confusion, but proximity. The itch of being one assumption away from something that worked. Elara stood in front of the board for a long time. She thought about Julian's face. She thought about the $20 bill folded in her breast pocket. She thought about the meeting she had attended once, a long time ago, in a different city, in a different life, where she had stood in front of a room not unlike this one, and presented a safety report that everyone in the room already knew the answer to, and that no one in the room was willing to act on. She thought about the turbine, about the blade shattering at 4,000 RPM, and what that would mean if it happened not in a test cell but in an actual aircraft. She picked up the red marker. She didn't fix the math. Fixing the math would have taken 10 minutes. What she did instead was more than that. She rebuilt the airflow model from the correct set of assumptions, annotating each step in the margin so the reasoning was visible, so that whoever found it in the morning would be able to follow the logic without her there to explain it. She applied the full Navier-Stokes equations for the compressible flow regime. Delta rho slash delta T plus rho equals 0. She circled the turbulence variable the team had omitted, the one that governed boundary layer behavior at the exact RPM range where the blade kept failing, and she wrote 3 words next to it in block letters. This is WHY. She recapped the marker. She looked at the board for another moment. Then she picked up her mop and finished the floor. She was in the elevator by 1:45 a.m. She did not look back. Dr. Priya Shin found it at 7:12 the next morning. She stood in front of the whiteboard with her coffee cup halfway to her mouth and her eyes moving across the red equations with the expression of someone reading a message they had been waiting a long time to receive. Then she put the coffee down, opened her laptop, and started running the simulation. By 8 o'clock, 3 other engineers had crowded behind her. By 8:30, they had the preliminary results. By 9, Marcus Webb, the lead structural engineer and the closest thing the Apex team had to a genuine expert in compressible flow, had gone very quiet in the way that people go quiet when they realize they have been wrong about something significant for a very long time. "It holds," he said, "at 4,000 RPM at 4.5 all the way up to 5.2. It holds." "Who did this?" Priya asked, not suspiciously, with genuine bewilderment. "That's my question," said Julian Thorne from the doorway. He was dressed for the Hargrove meeting already, 3 days early, because Julian dressed for the meeting he planned to have rather than the meeting he was currently in. He looked at the whiteboard, then at his team, then at the whiteboard again. "Someone was in this lab last night," he said. "Someone who knows what they're doing." He paused, "and whoever it was didn't sign their work." He said it the way you say something when you are already deciding what to do about it. "Pull the overnight security footage," he said. "All of it." The footage was high resolution. That was the thing about Apex Aeronautics. Julian had invested in the best cameras money could buy, because he trusted the building more than he trusted the people in it. He sat in the security office at 10:15 a.m., watching the R&D lab footage from 12:20 to 1:45 a.m., and his face went through several distinct phases. First, confusion, because the figure who walked into the lab was not one of his engineers. Then recognition, because he had seen that Navy jumpsuit before. Then something that was not quite anger, and not quite anything else he had a word for. The cleaning lady. She had picked up the marker with her left hand. She had stood at the board without hesitation, without looking anything up, without checking a reference. She had written the equations the way you write your own name from memory, with the loose confidence of something you no longer have to think about. He watched her circle the turbulence variable. He watched her write "this is WHY." He watched her pick up the mop. Julian leaned back in his chair. He was quiet for a long time. The security officer beside him did not speak, because something in Julian's expression had communicated very clearly that speaking would be a mistake. "What's her name?" Julian finally said. The officer checked the staff roster. "Elara Voss, 3 years on cleaning staff, floor 7 through 34. Before that, the system doesn't have." "Get her in my office," Julian said. "Friday morning, 9 a.m. "Should I tell her what it's about?" Julian looked at the frozen image on the screen, Elara in her jumpsuit, marker in hand, standing in front of equations that had defeated his entire engineering team for half a year. "Tell her it's routine," he said. "Comment below right now if you already know where this is going. And if you're new here, smash that subscribe button before we get to Friday, because the next part is the one everyone talks about." Elara knew it wasn't routine. She knew it the moment the message came through on Friday morning, not from HR, not from building management, but from Julian Thorne's personal assistant. She knew it the way she had known, 3 years ago, that the meeting her then-director had called was not going to go the way he had told her it would go. But she put on her jumpsuit. She clipped her tool belt, not out of habit, but deliberately, because she had decided in the hours before sleep that if this was going to be what she thought it was, she was going to walk into it as exactly what she was. She rode the elevator to 34. She walked past the model turbines and the signed photographs. Julian's assistant, a young man named Tyler who had clearly been told to be very neutral about this, led her to the boardroom and opened the door. She counted 6 people around the table before she even registered the room. She had not expected the boardroom to be full. 6 people sat around the table, and they were not Julian's engineering team. They were older, quieter, and more expensively dressed. The kind of people who had stopped needing to perform wealth because it had long ago become simply a condition of their existence. At the far end sat a woman Elara recognized from the financial press, Diane Hargrove, founder of the Hargrove Group, who was said to be the kind of investor who decided in the first 30 seconds whether she was interested. Julian stood at the head of the table. He smiled when Elara entered. It was not a warm smile. "There she is," he said, with the expansive, generous tone of a man who had already decided the outcome of the next 10 minutes. "Elara, come in, please. I want you to meet some colleagues of mine." She sat in the chair Tyler indicated, not at the table she noticed, but beside the wall, a chair slightly outside the circle. She recognized the architecture of it instantly. It was the chair that said, "You are here to be seen, not heard." "Elara has been part of our facilities team for 3 years, Julian said to the room, with the tone of a man at a dinner party sharing an amusing anecdote. "Very dedicated, very thorough." He paused. "She also, it turns out, likes to visit our R&D lab in the small hours of the morning and play with the whiteboards." A few of the investors glanced at Elara. She did not look away. "Now," Julian said, "I want to be very fair about this. I believe in being fair, and so before we discuss the necessary paperwork around confidentiality, because of course any calculations produced on company property belong to the company, that's just standard, I thought Elara deserved the chance to explain herself." He folded his hands on the table. In her own words, "Elara, what makes you think you're qualified to touch that board?" The room was very quiet. Elara looked at Julian. Then she looked at the whiteboard behind him, on which someone, Julian, she presumed, had written a brief summary of the corrected calculations, attributed to the Apex engineering team. She looked at Diane Hargrove, who was watching her with an expression that was impossible to read. She stood up. "May I?" she asked, nodding at the board. Julian's smile didn't move. "By all means," he said, "show us what you know." She walked to the board. She picked up the eraser, and she erased Julian's summary, all of it in 4 clean strokes. "What you had written here," she said, without turning around, "was a paraphrase of the corrected analysis. But the paraphrase contained an error. You described the boundary layer transition as operating under the assumption of laminar separation, which isn't what the corrected model shows and isn't consistent with the underlying thermophysics." She wrote 2 lines on the board. "The fundamental principle you were referencing, I think it was from Shapiro's compressible flow texts, which is a reasonable source, applies to isentropic conditions. The Apex 1 test environment is not isentropic. That's a meaningful distinction, and if you brief the Hargrove Group using the summary you had on that board, they will catch it." She turned around. Julian's smile had not moved, but something behind it had. "So," she said, "to answer your question, I have a Bachelor of Science in Aerospace Engineering from MIT, where I graduated top of my class. I have 7 years of industry experience in high-velocity propulsion systems. I was blacklisted from my last firm, Meridian Aerospace, not for incompetence, but for filing a formal safety report about a structural defect in their civilian turbine line that they did not want made public." She paused. "The defect was later confirmed by a federal investigation. The aircraft were grounded. That was 2 years ago, which is why I'm here, cleaning your floors instead of designing your engines." The room was completely silent. Diane Hargrove had not moved. She was still watching Elara with that unreadable expression. Then she said, very calmly, "Tell me about your approach to the fuel-to-weight ratio optimization on a variable cycle engine operating across both subsonic and supersonic envelopes." And something in Elara went quiet and clear, the way it always did when the question was a real one. She turned back to the board. What followed was 11 minutes that none of the people in that room would describe the same way afterward, because they were each watching a different thing. Julian's engineers, who had been brought in, Elara realized later, as witnesses watched the equations. The investors watched each other. Tyler, visible through the glass wall, watched with the open expression of someone watching a film reach its climax. Diane Hargrove watched Elara. When it was over, when Elara had capped the marker and stepped back and the board was covered in the clearest, most elegant technical argument most of them had seen in a professional context, Diane Hargrove was already reaching for her phone. "Julian," she said, not looking up, "I need 5 minutes with Ms. Voss, privately." "Diane," Julian said, "I think we should probably discuss the question of." "Julian," she looked up, "5 minutes." They spoke for 22 minutes. Elara did most of the talking for the first 10. She explained the Meridian situation in the same way she had explained it to the federal investigator 2 years ago, factually, without self-pity, with the relevant technical details in the correct sequence. Diane Hargrove did not interrupt. She asked 2 questions, both precise, both targeted at the parts of the story that other people had found convenient to overlook. Then Diane spoke for the last 12 minutes, and this was the part that Elara had not been prepared for. Because Diane Hargrove, it turned out, had been on the board of a firm called Precision Dynamics in 2019, and Precision Dynamics had been the silent minority investor in Meridian Aerospace when Elara's safety report had been filed. "I saw your report," Diane said quietly. "The full version, not the summary that circulated." She paused. "The decision not to act on it was not unanimous." Elara was very still. "I want you to know that," Diane said, "because I think you have spent 3 years believing that every person in that room looked at your work and chose to ignore it. And that isn't true." She looked at Elara directly. "Some of us tried. We were outvoted. I want you to know the difference." Elara didn't speak for a moment. "It doesn't change what happened," she said finally. "No," Diane agreed. "It doesn't, but it might change what you think is possible going forward." When they came out of the side conference room, Elara's expression was impossible to read. Diane Hargrove's was not. She was smiling, the small, precise smile of a woman who had found what she had come to find. "We'll have the contract drafted by end of day," she told Julian. "Chief Engineer, Apex Propulsion Division, reporting directly to the board." She glanced around the room. "The Hargrove Group's participation is contingent on Ms. Voss's involvement going forward. I want her on the Apex 1 certification before we proceed." She looked at Elara. "Is that acceptable to you?" "Yes," said Elara. Julian said nothing. He was looking at his phone, on the screen. The Hargrove Group's preliminary investment status had shifted from confirmed to pending, and the notification had arrived at the same moment Diane had stepped out of the conference room. The market read the signals faster than any press release could explain them. Elara walked to the door. She stopped beside the small table near the exit, where Julian had set down his things, his phone, his money clip, his coffee. She reached into her breast pocket and took out the $20 bill, still folded twice, exactly as she had folded it on Tuesday morning. She set it on the table beside his money clip. "Keep it," she said. "You're going to need the change." She didn't wait for a response. She walked out of the boardroom, past the model turbines and the signed photographs, and pressed the elevator button. When the doors opened, she stepped in. She pressed the button for the ground floor, the lobby, the exit. She thought about Tuesday morning, about 19 liters of water and a grip that had slipped, and 3 drops that had landed on a blueprint that cost more than her salary. She thought about a $20 bill dropped on a floor. She thought about a whiteboard covered in someone else's failure and a red marker, and a single variable that everyone had decided was too small to matter. She thought about all the things she had known and not said, for 3 years and for 7 years before that, because saying things out loud had a price that she had learned, painfully, to calculate. She thought about Diane Hargrove's voice, even precise, the voice of a woman who never asked a question she did not already know the shape of saying, "Is that acceptable to you?" The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened. Elara Voss walked into the lobby, through the revolving door, and out into the morning light of a city that had no idea what had just happened on the 34th floor. The traffic moved. The pigeons moved. A man sold coffee from a cart on the corner and did not look up. She stopped for a moment on the pavement. Then quietly, without fanfare, because knowledge had never required an audience, she smiled. The $20 bill was on Julian's table. The marker was capped. The board was full. And Elara Voss, who had spent 3 years being invisible, was done disappearing. If this story hit differently than you expected, that's the point. Stories like Elara's happen in real buildings, in real cities, to real people, and they don't always end in boardrooms. But sometimes they do. Hit that like button if you stayed till the end. Subscribe for more stories that remind you what competence looks like when it finally gets the floor. And drop a comment, I want to know. What did you feel in that boardroom moment? Because I read every single one.